Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we're here for the first in what I believe will be a 7-part series as we go ahead and matriculate through Robert Pinsky's The Sounds of Poetry, A Brief Guide. Now, I say I believe this will be a 7-part series because there are 7 parts of the book, but I am not sure that some of these chapters will break down neatly into a single video. But this is the first part, which is for the introduction. And I think that it is important here to start with the opening paragraph. The idea in the following pages is to help the reader hear more of what is going on in poems, and by hearing more, to gain in enjoyment and understanding. Going into the second paragraph, every speaker intuitively and accurately courses gracefully through immensely subtle manipulations of sound. We not only indicate, for example, where the accent in the word like question, but also preserve that accent when adding the difference between what was the question and yes, that was the question. This is a solid mission statement, but I remain at this stage casually skeptical. While, yes, we intonate these poems as we read them to ourselves, and sometimes as we hear them or read them aloud, I think that the crux of poetry is still inside the words, not their pronunciation. In fact, I think that the sound of poetry opens up interpretation, whereas diction, a change in diction, alters the poem completely. For example, I'll use my favorite poem, I Died for Beauty But Was Scarce Suggested in the Tomb. The sounds of this, the inflections of this, the emphasis that we're going with here, just on the words themselves, not even with the flow of the language or the rhythm therein. I died for beauty but was scarce suggested in the tomb. Emphasis on I suggests that there is a difference between someone else who died and what did they die for. I died for beauty but was scarce suggested in the tomb is an inflection that states that I died for beauty as opposed to living for it. I died for beauty but was scarce suggested in the tomb implies that beauty itself may have had some other expectation. I died for beauty, but was scarce suggested in the tomb, suggests that there is some other option besides beauty for which to die. I died for beauty, but was scarce suggested in the tomb, suggests that there was expectation on behalf of the speaker that scarcely was not how they would be adjusted in the tomb. I died for beauty but was scarce adjusted in the tomb suggests that, hold on, I'm losing it now, but was scarce adjusted in the tomb suggests that the opposite would have been preferred by the speaker, that the speaker would have been laid in prim and proper fashion, but was scarce adjusted in the tomb, putting the emphasis on the adjusted implies in some part that everything was fine. The death, the meaning, the funeral were fine, but the adjustment in the tomb was different, but was scarce adjusted in the tomb as opposed to out of the tomb, in the tomb as opposed to in a tomb, in the tomb as opposed to not in a tomb, not in some type of mausoleum for these ideas. So the emphasis that we place on any one of those words changes the interpretation of the poem, but the ideas at play, truth, beauty, and the anonymity between the two remain. However, if you change beauty to I died for meaning but was scarce suggested in the tomb, it's a completely different poem. Moving on to paragraph 3, we get this. We do not need to be taught such things. If they were taught in school, we would find them hard and make a mess of them. Which, of course, makes all of us remember the pains of reading aloud in high school when you weren't familiar with the texts or their meanings or even your own changing voice. And I think that there is a great deal of gratitude among many writers that these nuances went untaught, though it has largely led to a less functionally literate society, perhaps, in that we do not have the emphasis on reading that we may have once had, much less the appreciation of poetry. And I think that is one of the motivating factors for me doing this series and other textual series on poetry on the channel. Pinsky goes on to note how we don't teach these nuances in language by saying, we already have finely developed powers that let us appreciate the sound of even an isolated single line of poetry, even if we have little idea of the meaning. And it is interesting to recall here Noam Chomsky's idea of the universal grammar. Chomsky posited that language acquisition has a genetic component. Further, parts of these languages will always develop separately. People will always develop and acquire language, and that language will always have certain qualities. Function will be separate from form, from content, Nouns will be separate from verbs, etc. Also, if you pick a baby up from anywhere in the world and transport it to a different society where they speak a much different language, that baby's going to learn the language of the culture in which it grows up. Of his own theory, Chomsky had stated, it is perfectly obvious that there is some genetic function that distinguishes humans from other animals, and that it is language specific. The theory of that genetic component, whatever it turns out to be, is what is called universal grammar. Also of note, this theory, which was championed by Chomsky in the 60s, is today disavowed by Chomsky. So with all of this talk about the innate nature of language and language acquisition, and the pains of teaching the sounds of language, what are we doing reading a book about it? And we get a little bit about that on page 5 and into page 6, as Pinsky says, I tried to explain the principles in plain language with a minimum of special terms objectively, by paying close attention to particular poems and specific words. Technical language, vague impressions about the emotional effects of sound, the supposedly exuberant or doleful W's, the anxious or sensual T's, etc., elaborate systems, categories that need memorizing, little accent marks, and special typographical symbols. All these I work to avoid. Sounds good. And I am looking forward to being talked into whatever it is that you're selling here, even if it is not just emphasis on words, which I very highly doubt it is. And we have some hints with the brief lines of poetry that he chose to illuminate. The fire that stirs about her when she stirs. In a smart burnous Cador looked on amused. Absence my presence is, strangeness my grace. Back out of all this now, too much for us. Let be final of seem. Further in summer than the birds, sorrow is my own yard. All of these examples seem to roll off of the tongue and require less emphasis on specific words than that line of Emily Dickinson, which I provided. So we'll see, Penske. We'll see. That is the first of what I believe will be a 7-part series, journeying through the sounds of poetry, a brief guide by Robert Penske. And hey, we've got a lot of different series going on the channel, and it is one thing that we are working very hard towards, to bring more poetry and short stories, especially to BookTube, but also read-alongs of novels and other bits and scraps. We're working on essays. We're posting essays on the Patreon page that we have. We're working towards Strip Quarterly again. And we've got a lot of things in the works, so if you enjoy this sort of thing, I would appreciate it if you hit the like button, because it really helps us out here on the channel. Maybe hit subscribe, and if you were so inclined, there is a link, as always, to our Patreon to be found in the description below.